Hello, I'm Christian Fraser in New Delhi, and this is The Context.
The G20 is a broad group of countries and they have different perspectives, but it's still important to be talking to people, to be engaging, to highlighting things like Russia's aggression and the impact it's having. It's still important to have these conversations.
For the government, certainly this is that moment. They want to say, we are the voice of the people, the global south as they're calling it. So, we are the voice of the developing countries. We are the people who can talk to you on their behalf.
It is outrageous that President Putin is again blocking the Black Sea, preventing or making sure that no Ukrainian grain is anymore coming out of the Black Sea and going onto the international market.
One Earth, one family, one future, the slogan that is omnipresent here in New Delhi. But in truth, this is a deeply divided club of nations. President Putin is absent, so too is President Xi. So what can be achieved at this weekend's summit? We'll get into that this evening with our panel from London, Peter Ricketts, former National Security Advisor to the British government, and also with us Indrana Bagchi, CEO of the Ananta Aspen Centre, a think tank here in New Delhi. A very good evening and a warm welcome to New Delhi. Just over my right shoulder here, that is the Bharat Mandapam, the great exhibition hall where in just a few hours' time the G20 leaders, joined by others, will begin the first day of their summit. The leaders of the G20 represent 2/3 of humanity on Earth, 85% of the economic output. The guest list for this weekend's summit might be a little light, missing one or two key names, but this represents the most important meeting that India has ever hosted. Prime Minister Modi has been guiding the G20 agenda since the beginning of the year when India first assumed the rotating presidency, and it's a matter of huge national pride. You cannot travel a few metres in downtown New Delhi at the moment without encountering Mr. Modi, who will tell you in the loudest terms that India is the mother of democracy. Some of you might question how healthy that democracy is, but no question when it comes to the G20, there has been plenty of open debate. All told, they've held 240 meetings and working groups, more than any previous summit, in cities right across the country. Mr. Datta, very good of you to join us this evening. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. We're going to take a short break. You're watching BBC News. Let's take a quick look at some of the other stories making news today. In the UK, the Metropolitan Police are investigating a sighting of the terror suspect Daniel Khalif, who escaped from Wandsworth Prison on Wednesday by strapping himself to the underside of a food delivery van. The police are also exploring the possibility that staff at the prison might have helped Khalif. The Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, said the escape was clearly pre-planned, a development he described as extremely concerning. The first anniversary of King Charles's accession to the throne has been marked today by gun salutes in London, Edinburgh and Cardiff. The soldiers and horses that took part in Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral procession returned for the anniversary salute in the King's honour. The King and Queen visited Crathy Kirk, close to Balmoral Castle. Health authorities in the UK have published new data about the latest COVID variant. It appears to show that transmission is taking place in the community, although the scientists say that at the current time there's not enough data to know how much of a threat it is posing to public health. You're watching BBC News. Tomorrow, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will meet for a bilat with Prime Minister Modi. Quite a moment when you think about it. A Prime Minister with Indian heritage, the old power and the new, and certainly in terms of size, the old colonial power is now the junior partner. India is the most populous nation on earth. It now has a population 3 times the size of the British Empire at its peak. So from a UK perspective, a free trade agreement would be hugely valuable and an important part of that wider Indo-Pacific tilt which Mr. Sunak is after post-Brexit. This is what he had to say as he arrived earlier today. Yeah, interesting to hear from the government today saying that they didn't want to take what we would call an early harvest deal, a skinny deal, if you will, because Prime Minister Sunak thinks that in time they can add a lot more to it, and it's better doing it now than the other side of it. Listen, for the moment, thank you. We're going to take a short break. The other side of the break, we're going to talk about the big fault lines through this summit. That, of course, is the tensions between India and China, and we'll talk about the global South as well, which is certainly a focus for Prime Minister Modi. Bangladesh, I should tell you, is coming to the first summit in 18 years, which I guess is an indictment in and of itself. So stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context from New Delhi and the G20 summit. Coming up, we'll discuss India's focus on the global south. This year, India held a virtual summit to solicit input from over 100 developing and island nations. So what is it that they most want? And are the developed nations doing their part on the commitments already made? Big day here in New Delhi, big day also in Paris. It is the start of the Rugby World Cup. So let's pause for a second and get some sports news. Here is Lizzie Greenwood-Hughes. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello there, thank you. Yes, it is a big day and it's a really big opening match. Host France are in action against New Zealand, as you say, in Paris at the Stade de France. They've been going around a quarter of an hour. New Zealand are ahead. They're currently leading 5-3. Now, France are one of the hot favourites for this tournament, yet they've never won a World Cup. The All Blacks, of course, are no strangers to World Cup success with 3 world titles to their name. So 5-3, the latest score there in Paris. Oh, it's going to be an exciting season. Well, that is all the sport for now. Back to you, Christian.
Lizzie, thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit more about the splits here at the G20. President Xi, you might remember, was very visible at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg just a couple of weeks ago, but he's not coming here. He's a no-show. It's the first time in 16 years he's missed a G20 summit. Also absent President Putin, who of course remains under an international arrest warrant. But both countries will be represented here this weekend. The Chinese Premier Li Qiang is here. Also Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister from Russia. I've been speaking to Jyoti Malhotra, who writes on foreign relations for the newspaper Print India, and I asked her what Prime Minister Modi would make of the Chinese snub. Well, I'm very glad you said that, Peter, because right after the break, we're going to hear about the problems that the global south are facing. In the UK and around the world, you are watching BBC News.
Different stories from across the UK.
About the future.
For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
Welcome back. A lot of the things that will be talked about here at the summit in New Delhi will be about the global south, which is a pretty confusing term, not least because, as you'll see from the chart that the Indian Foreign Ministry put out recently, some of the countries we're referring to here are in fact in the northern hemisphere, the countries in the former Yugoslavia, for example, or the countries in North Africa, India even. The term seems to have become a catch-all phrase for all the developing nations. And Mr. Modi invited 125 of them to his Voice of the Global South summit in January. Not China and Pakistan, interestingly, but all of the countries that you would think would complain that they are underrepresented at the top table and too often ignored by the developed nations, as Peter was just saying. Mr. Modi clearly sees an opportunity to lead here. I've been speaking to Suhasini Haidar, and she is the diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu. And they will arrive at the UN General Assembly discussions in New York in 10 days' time. So you have to see it in that perspective. The other side of the break, we're going to hear from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, on her expectations this weekend and what kind of language she wants on Ukraine. Also, we'll talk climate. The G20 accounts for 80% of global emissions. What can they do constructively over the next 2 days? Stay with us. Hello, I'm Christian Fraser at the G20 summit in New Delhi, and this is the context.
It is outrageous that President Putin is again blocking the Black Sea, preventing or making sure that no Ukrainian grain is anymore coming out of the Black Sea and going onto the international market.
The G20 is a broad group of countries and they have different perspectives, but it's still important to be talking to people, to be engaging, to highlighting things like Russia's aggression and the impact it's having. It's still important to have these conversations.
For the government, certainly this is that moment. They want to say, we are the voice of the people, the global south as they're calling it. So, we are the voice of the developing countries. We are the people who can talk to you on their behalf.
The leaders are here, and we are just a few hours away from some intense discussion here in New Delhi. But what will the G20 achieve? We'll hear this hour from Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. We'll talk climate and we'll discuss the clean-up. Where are the street hawkers, the rough sleepers, the edgier side of New Delhi? None of it on display this week, and in fact some of it hidden behind a giant wall. Our panel with us this evening here in New Delhi, Indrani Bagchi, CEO of the Ananta Aspen Centre in London. We have Peter Ricketts, former National Security Advisor to the British government, and from Washington joining us this hour, Joel Rubin, former advisor to the US State Department. Welcome back. You might recall that at this summit in Bali this time last year, there was an almighty tussle to secure a paragraph in the final communique that summed up the wide condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine. We deplore in the strongest terms, said the final draft, the aggression by the Russian Federation, and we demand its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. But that also included a line that not all countries shared that view. And this year, a compromise on that text might be even harder to achieve. Ahead of the summit, not one communique has emerged from all the meetings and working groups that have been staged. Russia and China have vetoed every statement. In fact, there are now concerns mounting that maybe a final communique might not emerge at all. I've been speaking to Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, about the language she wants to see on Ukraine and why that is so important. Yes, you see, this is why we have Peter on the programme. He has all the skills of an ambassador. Peter, for the moment, thank you very much for that. We're going to take a short break in the UK and around the world. You're watching BBC News. Let's take a look at some of the other stories that are making news headlines today. In the UK, the Metropolitan Police are investigating a sighting of the terror suspect Daniel Khalif, who escaped from Wandsworth Prison on Wednesday by strapping himself to the underside of a food delivery van. The police are also exploring the possibility that staff at the prison might have helped Khalifa. The Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, said the escape was clearly pre-planned, a development he described as extremely concerning. The first anniversary of King Charles's accession to the throne has been marked today by gun salutes in London, Edinburgh and Cardiff. The soldiers and horses that took part in Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral procession returned for the anniversary salute in the King's honour. The King and Queen visited Crathy Kirk, close to Balmoral Castle. And the health authorities in the UK have published new data about the latest COVID variant. It appears to show that transmission is taking place in the community, although the scientists say there's not enough data as yet to know how much of a threat it poses to public health. You're watching BBC News. By the end of India's G20 presidency, more than 200 meetings will have taken place in 60 cities across the country. 100,000 delegates will have taken part from 125 countries. That's an unprecedented level of engagement in G20 terms, and that is testament to India's commitment to finding solutions on some of the most intractable problems. But on climate policy, some would say they've come up short. The joint meeting of G20 environment and climate ministers that was organised by the Indian presidency in July in Chennai failed to reach consensus on some very important issues. Coal wasn't even mentioned, still a key source of energy for India and China. If we are to have any chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then really pre-industrial emissions would need to be peaking by 2025. But heading into this weekend summit, there's been no agreed wording on reducing methane emissions, moving away from fossil fuels, or speeding up the energy transition. And the G20 will need to make good on the loss and damage payments they promised to the vulnerable countries, those affected by rising seas or persistent drought. I've been talking to Aditya Vilayathan Pillai. He's a fellow at the Centre for Policy Research who specialises on climate, energy and the environment.
Therefore, the scope to be spending more now on pushing the renewables agenda more quickly, being prepared to pay the price the market demands, that is not there.
Yeah. OK. Peter, thank you. We're going to go to a short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Yesterday on the drive here from the airport, you couldn't really miss the enormous lengths the Indian government has gone to spruce up downtown New Delhi. We'll talk about that this next half hour. Yeah, let's get into that because the areas around this Bharat Mandapam Conference Centre have been transformed ahead of the weekend summit. The city's gleaming, but there has been this criticism of the Modi government. The central reservations have all been swept. The hawkers have been banned from the city centre. There are new fountains at road junctions, new planting on the roundabouts. I'm told that along the pavements, they've placed 700,000 pot plants and 130,000 security guards to ensure they don't go missing. I guess that there are some people who spot an opportunity to spruce up their gardens. But anyway, Samira Hussain has been looking at the cleanup around the city and the controversy that goes with it. He is very much attached to the G20 and the agenda here this week. His face on all the billboards, as we've said. Yogita, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for your company. I'm going to get the panel to respond to some of those points that Yogita raised there, but we're going to take a quick break. In the UK and around the world, you are watching BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK.
And helping to prevent bullying.
Welcome back to our coverage. Our coverage of the G20 here in New Delhi. Joel Rubin, save me while I clear my throat. Talk to me about what you just heard from Yogita there and what you make of it, particularly the issues around democracy. Yeah. But very important that you mentioned it. Thank you for that. We are at the end of our programme this evening. We need to clear the stage here to allow the staff to go to bed. It is just after 2 o'clock in the morning, and somehow we've got to find a bus to get back to the city centre. But we will be here tomorrow, all being well, for the official start of the summit. I hope you'll join us for that. My thanks to Indrani Bagchi, Peter Ricketts, Joel Rubin for their company this evening and for all their analysis. And thank you for watching at home. I hope you have a very good evening. Good night.
Good evening, I'm Lizzie Greenwich-Hughes here with your latest sports news. And we're starting with the opening game at the Rugby Union World Cup. And it's turned into the cracker everyone had hoped it would be as France are leading New Zealand